Ever think about how some things seem, I don't know, super simple at first glance, but then get really complicated the more you look into them?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, say, the idea of a country having an official language. Sounds straightforward enough, right? But it can get messy fast. We're going to dive into that today.
Okay, sounds interesting.
Specifically, we're looking at the U.S. and something that happened recently that's causing a lot of discussion.
Right.
Our source material is an article from the PI News.
The PI News.
Yeah, it's an online magazine, focuses mainly on international education.
Oh?
This article was published March 6th, 2025. It's about President Trump during his second term, signing his 78th executive order.
78th, wow.
That's what the article says. And this one declares English the official language of the United States.
The U.S. has never had an official language at the federal level before. Right?
Nope, never. So this is a pretty significant development.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Language is so tied up with identity, with opportunity, even political power. So declaring one language official, even in a diverse country like the U.S., it has big implications.
Big implications. So for this deep dive, we're going to unpack a few things. Like first, what does this executive order actually do?
Yeah, good question.
Is it symbolic mostly, or is this going to have real impacts on people's lives?
Right.
Second, how are different groups reacting to this? What are their main concerns? What are people saying?
Yeah, and we need to look at the historical and legal context, too.
Yeah.
Like, what are the precedents? How does this new order fit or clash with them?
Okay, so let's start with the order itself. It says its aims are, and I'm quoting here, to streamline communication, reinforce shared national values, and create a more cohesive and efficient society.
Okay, sounds, pretty straightforward. Maybe even positive at first.
Right, like who doesn't want efficiency?
Yeah.
But it's important to note that the order doesn't actually ban using other languages. It doesn't say, no Spanish, no Mandarin, English only.
Right.
What it does is it gives federally funded agencies the option to provide services in languages other than English. Or not. It's up to them.
So it's more like a strong incentive to use English in all official matters.
Exactly.
That's interesting because the order also talks about celebrating the U.S.'s long tradition of multilingualism.
Yeah, you picked up on that too, huh? It seems like a bit of a contradiction.
Definitely. Like, are they trying to promote English as the language while also acknowledging the reality that the U.S. has always been multilingual?
And can those two goals really coexist? It creates this tension, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of tension, the article highlights some strong reactions to the order, especially from TESOL.
TESOL.
Yeah, the main professional association for teachers of English to speakers of other languages. Teachers of English to speakers of other languages.
Right.
They are fiercely opposed to this, arguing it will deprive individuals of full access to federal services.
And their concern makes sense because this order actually revokes a Clinton-era mandate that required federal agencies to provide language assistance.
Right. So before it was a requirement, now it's optional. And if you think about areas like education or healthcare,
Yeah, those are essential services.
essential, that shift could have a huge impact on people who aren't fluent in English.
Huge impact, meaning it could create a lot more difficulty in getting access to those things.
And we're not just talking about a small group here. The Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus is also really against the order.
Yeah.
They're saying it's a way to discriminate against immigrants and anyone with limited English skills.
And, think about how many people that is.
A lot, right?
The article mentions 42 million Spanish speakers in the U.S. and 3 million who speak Chinese.
Wow. And that's just two groups.
So yeah, the potential impact is huge.
Okay, so we've got this order, a lot of debate, concerns about discrimination, possible limitations on language access.
Lots to unpack.
Where does the law fit into all of this?
That's where the historical and legal context gets important. We have to go back to 1974 and a Supreme Court case, Lau v. Nichols. This case established that schools are required to provide support for English learners to overcome language barriers in their education.
So we have legal precedent protecting the right to language assistance, at least when it comes to education.
Right.
How does this new order work with that?
Well, that's where the conflict comes in.
Oh.
Critics argue that the new order contradicts Lau v. Nichols and could even go against the broader Civil Rights Act, which says no discrimination based on national origin.
And language is part of that, right?
Right. So pushing English only in this way, it could be legally tricky.
Tricky. Plus, this isn't brand new. This idea of making English the official language has been around.
Oh, yeah.
The article mentions that in 2021, Republican lawmakers tried to pass legislation to make English official.
Yeah.
It failed. Didn't go through. So this executive order is part of a larger movement. And it's stirring up a lot of debate about, language rights, access to important services. Plus, there's a symbolic side to this, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Think about what happened right at the start of Trump's second term. The Spanish language version of the White House website, gone.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. What happened with that? Did they ever put it back up?
As of March 6th, 2025, according to this article, it's still down.
Still down. Wow. That's a pretty powerful symbol, like a visual representation of this shift towards an English-first approach.
Yeah, even without explicitly saying national language, it makes a statement.
It does, and it raises questions about belonging. What does it mean to be American?
Yeah.
What role does language play in that?
Yeah.
And how do we balance having a shared language with respecting the languages and rights of diverse communities?
Such important question.
We'll be back in a moment to dig into more of the implications of this and what it could mean for the future of language in the U.S. Really makes you think, is pushing for one dominant language, even in a place as diverse as the U.S., really going to lead to more unity? Or does it end up pushing away, alienating people who don't speak that language fluently?
It's a big question, yeah. It gets to the heart of what it means to be part of a nation and how much language shapes that feeling of belonging. There are good arguments on both sides, and people have been debating this for a long time.
It seems like the arguments in favor of making English official, they often come down to practicality and a sense of, a shared national identity.
Exactly. People who support it, they might point to, the cost of providing government services in multiple languages.
Right.
Translating documents, training bilingual staff, making sure everything's clear across different languages. It can get expensive.
And then beyond just the money, there's the symbolic weight that language carries, right?
Yeah.
The idea that a shared language can bring people together.
Yeah, like a social glue that helps bind a diverse population together.
Well, exactly, especially when it feels like everything's so divided these days.
Yeah.
That idea of a common language as common ground, it can be really appealing.
It can be. But then, of course, there's the other side.
Right.
The argument that saying one language is more important than others, that's just inherently discriminatory. And you risk leaving out people who aren't fluent in that language.
And it's not hard to see how this kind of policy, even if it's not intended that way, could make people anxious, especially within immigrant communities.
Oh, for sure. It can feel like their languages and cultures are being pushed aside.
Like they don't belong as much.
Exactly. And that feeling, it's not just because of this one order. It goes way back.
Historically.
Yeah, throughout U.S. history, language has been used as a way to try to assimilate immigrants, to pressure them to give up their native languages, almost like a price of admission.
And that history still matters today. It influences how people interpret things like this executive order.
It's not just about the words themselves. It's about the context, the history, the power dynamics behind language.
And the order itself, it's almost like it tries to acknowledge both sides.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, it's making English the official language. But on the other, it says it recognizes and celebrates the long tradition of multilingualism in the U.S.
Trying to have it both ways.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if you can really promote English as the main official language and at the same time truly respect and support other languages.
It's a tough question. Can one language really unify a diverse nation? Or does that unity come at a cost for those who don't speak that language well?
Yeah.
The article mentions that there have been other attempts to make English official going back decades.
Right.
Were there any patterns or themes in those earlier efforts?
What's interesting is how often they were tied to anxieties about immigration and demographics changing. Like in the early 20th century, there were all those Americanization campaigns trying to assimilate immigrants, and language was a big part of that.
So it's not just about communication. It's about what people think the language represents, about who's in and who's out.
For some people, English equals American identity, a symbol of unity and shared values.
Right.
But for others, it represents being forced to give up their own languages and cultures.
It's a good reminder that language is never neutral. There's always social meaning, power dynamics, historical context, all wrapped up in it.
And those dynamics are playing out right now. As we figure out what this executive order really means, it's not just about government services or efficiency. It's about who gets included and excluded, who has opportunities, who has a voice.
This order feels like just the latest chapter in a much longer story about language in America, and we're still writing it.
A story with real consequences. The reactions to the order, the legal stuff, the long-term impact, it's all unfolding.
Okay, so we've talked about the culture, the legal side of this order. Now, I think we need to talk about the money. How could this impact the U.S. economy?
Yeah, good point. That's often overlooked in these debates. There are potential economic benefits and drawbacks. Finding the right balance is key.
So let's start positive. Some argue that having English as the official language and everyone being fluent could be good for the economy.
Makes sense on the surface. If everyone speaks the same language, workplace communication gets easier. Fewer misunderstandings, easier training, might even make everyone more productive.
And from a business standpoint, having a workforce that's all fluent in English, that could make the U.S. more appealing for foreign investors.
Right. But it's not that simple. While there might be some benefits, there are also potential problems with limiting language access. And those problems, they might actually outweigh the good stuff.
So it's not as easy as saying English means a better economy, huh? What are some of the possible problems we should be thinking about?
I think one of the big ones is that if you make things harder for people who aren't fluent in English, you're limiting what they can do in the economy.
Yeah, makes sense.
Think about it. If you can't access education or healthcare or job training in your native language, how are you supposed to get ahead?
Like we'd be holding back a huge chunk of our own workforce.
Exactly. And there's actually more and more research showing that linguistic diversity can be good for the economy.
Really?
Yeah. When people can communicate in multiple languages, it opens up new markets for businesses, it helps with innovation, and it strengthens our ability to trade internationally.
So this executive order, even though it's trying to make things more efficient, could end up making the U.S. less competitive globally?
That's a real possibility.
And we have to think about the effect on particular industries too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Lots of parts of the U.S. economy, agriculture, hospitality, healthcare, they depend on immigrant labor. And a lot of those workers speak other languages.
Right.
If those workers are suddenly running into more problems because of language access issues, those industries could suffer.
And it's not just the workers, it's the businesses and the customers who rely on those industries.
And what about tourism?
Oh, that's a great point.
That's a huge part of the U.S. economy.
Huge. And lots of tourists come from places where they don't speak English.
Yeah, if those tourists feel unwelcome or they can't even figure out basic things because of language problems, that could really hurt tourism.
It could. So you see, this executive order isn't just some abstract debate about language. It has real-world economic impacts that could affect all of us, whether we speak English or not.
It's like it's trying to fix one problem, but it might be creating a bunch of new ones.
That's always a risk, especially with something as complicated as language. There are always trade-offs and unintended consequences.
Well, we've gone over a lot today.
We have.
From the details of the executive order to the bigger picture stuff, historical, cultural, legal, and economic.
We've looked at arguments for and against making English official, the laws involved, and what might happen because of all of this.
And I think one thing is clear. There are no simple answers here. This is a complicated issue, and it needs careful thought and open discussion.
Absolutely. As you keep thinking about all of this and forming your own opinions, here's a final thought. Is language something that brings people together, like some people say, or can it divide us? How can we make sure that our language policies support both communication and inclusion, national identity, and the rights of individuals?
Those are important questions, especially as the world becomes more interconnected and multilingual. And that's what the deep dive is all about, giving you the information you need to understand these complicated issues and make your own decisions. Don't just take our word for it. Go deeper, look at the sources we talked about, and come to your own conclusions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.